Most people associate silence with surrender. When someone goes quiet, the assumption is that they have given up, that they ran out of fight or simply stopped caring. But in the psychology of avoidant attachment, silence carries a meaning that runs much deeper than most people realize. And when that silence comes from a super empath, it does not signal weakness or defeat. It signals something that fundamentally shifts the emotional landscape of the entire dynamic. There comes a specific point in many of these relationships when the empath stops explaining themselves. They stop chasing after emotional clarity that was never really being offered. They stop trying to repair a connection that kept breaking in the same places. And the moment that shift happens, the emotional ground beneath the avoidance feet begins to move in ways they did not see coming and are not prepared for. An avoidant person can manage a great deal of emotional input. They have usually spent years developing the ability to stay composed when emotions rise around them. They can handle someone being upset. They can tolerate conflict, step back from arguments, and wait out emotional storms with a kind of detached patience that often looks like strength. They can even manage on some level someone pleading for more closeness or attention because in a strange and uncomfortable way, those reactions still confirm something important to them. They confirm that the avoidant still holds emotional weight in the other person's life. The pursuit, the tears, even the frustration, these things are all proof that the bond is still active and that the avoidant still occupies a significant place in someone else's emotional world. As long as someone is reacting, the avoidant knows they still matter. And knowing they matter without having to become vulnerable to maintain it is a form of control that avoidant people often rely on far more deeply than they would ever admit. But there is one thing that the avoidant ego genuinely does not know how to absorb. That is the experience of authentic, peaceful, emotional detachment from someone who once understood them in a way almost no one else ever had. Not anger, not ultimatums, not dramatic exits, simply the quiet, unhurried withdrawal of someone who finally decided to stop abandoning their own inner world for the sake of maintaining a connection that consistently asked too much and gave back too little. That particular silence creates something entirely different from the emotional reactions an avoidant knows how to navigate. It does not register as conflict. It registers as disappearance. And that disappearance creates a kind of internal disruption that the avoidance defense system was never actually built to handle. One of the least discussed aspects of avoidant attachment psychology is the degree to which many avoidant people unconsciously depend on emotional pursuit. On the outside, they project independence. They appear self-contained, unmoved, difficult to reach. They push people away and seem entirely comfortable with the resulting distance. But beneath that exterior, many avoidant people have quietly built their sense of emotional stability on the knowledge that someone is still out there waiting for them. The attention and the emotional availability of the other person functions as a kind of background reassurance, something they may not consciously acknowledge, but something their nervous system registers and relies on. It tells them they are valued without requiring them to be vulnerable. It provides the warmth of being wanted without demanding the exposure of being known. And as long as that reassurance exists somewhere in the background, the avoidant feels a low-level sense of emotional safety that they rarely even notice until it disappears. This is what makes the super empath's eventual withdrawal so destabilizing. When that background reassurance vanishes, the avoidant is left without something they did not fully realize they had been leaning on. The emotional foundation they were standing on turns out to have been built partly on someone else's continued investment. And when that investment is quietly redirected, what remains is a version of emotional exposure the avoidant spent years architecting their entire personality to avoid. A super empath is not your average relationship partner. They process emotion at a depth that most people never reach. They are not simply empathetic in the surface level sense of being kind or considerate. They genuinely feel what others are carrying. They notice the pain underneath someone's silence. They detect the fear inside someone's emotional walls without needing it to be explained to them. And because they see so clearly, they tend to be extraordinarily patient with people whose behavior would send most others walking in the opposite direction. They give chances not because they are naive, but because they genuinely believe in the human capacity for growth, and because they can feel what the other person is actually experiencing beneath all the defensive behavior. That combination of insight and compassion makes them rare. And for an avoidant person whose deepest fear is being exposed and then abandoned, finding someone who sees through the walls without trying to tear them down can feel like the first genuinely safe emotional experience they have ever had. That safety becomes something the avoidant quietly depends on over time, even as they continue to pull away, even as they continue to manage the relationship from a distance, even as they periodically disappear without explanation or return without acknowledgement of the pattern. The empath remains present. The empath continues to understand. The empath keeps making space for the avoidant's limitations while somehow also maintaining the warmth that the avoidant was drawn to in the first place. For a while, the avoidant operates within this arrangement as though it will simply continue indefinitely, as though the empath's patience is an unlimited resource. But super empaths are not endlessly renewable. They are deeply feeling human beings with their own emotional limits, their own need for consistency and reciprocity, their own inner world that requires care and attention. At some point, the pattern becomes undeniable. The disappearing and returning, the warmth that appears and then retreats, the emotional inconsistency that keeps repeating in exactly the same ways. The empath begins to see the pattern for what it is rather than continuing to interpret it through the lens of hope. They begin to understand that seeing someone clearly does not mean taking responsibility for their healing. That genuine empathy includes empathy for yourself. That loving someone does not require dismantling your own sense of peace in order to maintain the connection. And when that understanding settles in deeply enough, something changes. The empath's energy begins to shift inward. Their attention moves toward their own healing rather than remaining fixed on managing the dynamics of a relationship that has been taking more than it returns. The moment this happens, the avoidant feels it. They may not name it immediately. They may not consciously understand what has changed, but something in the quality of the interaction is different, and their system registers the difference even before their mind has fully processed it. The emotional warmth that was always available feels slightly less accessible. The responses come with less emotional energy behind them. The sense of being the center of the empath's concern begins to feel less certain. And uncertainty, for someone whose entire psychological architecture is built around maintaining control over emotional closeness, is deeply uncomfortable. When the super empath stops chasing, the disruption this creates in the avoidant's internal world is larger than most people on the outside would ever guess. Because the chasing was not simply an inconvenience the avoidant was tolerating. It was, in a hidden way, exactly what they had come to expect and to rely upon. The pattern of withdrawal followed by pursuit had become the emotional rhythm of the relationship. The avoidant would create distance, and the empath would close it. The avoidant would go quiet, and the empath would reach out. Over time, this rhythm became so predictable that the avoidant stopped consciously registering it as something that was happening. It simply became the shape of the relationship, a shape that confirmed, without requiring any vulnerability from the avoidant, that the connection was still intact and that they still mattered. When that rhythm is broken, the silence that follows is not neutral. It is disorienting. The avoidant finds themselves waiting for the familiar response that does not come. The outreach that once arrived reliably is no longer arriving. The emotional energy that was always available in the background has shifted somewhere they cannot access, and in that unfamiliar quiet, internal questions begin to surface. Why is nothing happening? Why is there no reaction? Have they actually moved on? Do I no longer have the influence I thought I had? These questions create a form of internal anxiety that avoidant people are generally not practiced at managing because they have historically been the ones who controlled when connection happened and when it did not. Suddenly, that control feels significantly less certain. The second significant shift happens when the empath begins to become genuinely emotionally unavailable. Not in the performed way the avoidant has always been emotionally unavailable, as a strategy or a protective measure, but in the authentic way that comes from having redirected your energy toward your own well-being. The empath stops explaining every emotional nuance of their experience. They stop initiating conversations designed to restore emotional clarity. They stop trying to repair misunderstandings that the avoidant never fully acknowledged in the first place. The emotional openness that the avoidant had always been able to count on starts to feel more bounded, more self-contained, quieter in a way that does not invite the same kind of emotional access it once did. For the avoidant, this change is deeply unfamiliar. The empath had always been emotionally transparent, consistently available, willing to process and explain and stay present even through difficulty. That predictability had been its own form of emotional safety. But now the predictability is gone. The warmth still exists in some form, but it is no longer freely available. The access has narrowed, and the avoidant, who built their entire sense of relational power around controlling emotional closeness through distance, now finds themselves on the receiving end of the very dynamic they spent years creating. The emotional uncertainty they once generated in the empath has quietly migrated to their own experience. The empath is also no longer seeking the avoidance validation. The years of waiting for small gestures of acknowledgement, for signs that their presence mattered, for some indication that the feelings they brought to the relationship were valued and returned, that waiting has ended. The empath has found, through the painful process of recognizing what was and was not being offered, a relationship with their own worth that does not require the avoidance confirmation to remain stable. That emotional independence completely changes the relational power dynamic in a way the avoidant was not expecting. The empath is no longer emotionally organized around them, and for the first time, the avoidant begins to feel what it is like to want emotional access from someone who is no longer making it unconditionally available. The third major sign in this dynamic appears when the super empath stops being emotionally reactive to the avoidance behavior. This is where the power shift becomes most visible. For a long time, the avoidance emotional patterns produced consistent results. Disappearing created anxiety in the empath. Returning created relief and hope. Giving small amounts of attention created gratitude. Withdrawing again created confusion and renewed effort. Each of these cycles confirmed to the avoidant that they still had emotional influence, that their actions still registered and produced predictable outcomes. Even when the empath's reactions were painful ones, frustration or sadness or quiet desperation, they still confirmed the connection. Emotional reactions of any kind tell the person being reacted to that they still have the power to affect the other person's inner world. But when the super empath reaches a certain point of inner clarity, the reactions change. The avoidant disappears, and there is no wave of anxiety-driven messages. The avoidant sends a brief, low-effort reconnection, and it does not produce the excited response it once did. The emotional manipulation that once worked, whether deliberate or unconscious, begins to meet a calm steadiness that does not shift under pressure. The empath is not responding from pain anymore. They are responding from a grounded, settled place that the avoidant cannot easily unsettle. And losing the ability to produce emotional reactions in someone you care about, even if you have never fully admitted that you care, is genuinely disorienting. The avoidant's sense of emotional influence depended on the empath's continued reactivity. The whole architecture of control was built on the assumption that distance would produce pursuit and that pursuit confirmed value. When that assumption fails, the entire structure it supported begins to feel unstable. The avoidant starts trying to read a person they once understood clearly and finding that the signals have changed. The empath has become harder to predict. Their emotional responses no longer follow the familiar pattern. And that loss of readability creates a specific kind of psychological discomfort that avoidant people are profoundly ill-equipped to manage because the whole purpose of their emotional walls was to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. The fourth shift cuts deeper into the avoidant's sense of identity than any of the previous ones. It happens when the super empath stops seeing them through the lens of complexity and mystery that once defined the connection. In the beginning, the empath interpreted the avoidant's emotional distance as something meaningful. They read depth into the silences, saw complexity behind the walls, believed there was something uniquely profound and misunderstood about the person they were trying to reach. That lens of fascination gave the avoidant a particular kind of emotional power. Their unavailability seemed to make them more interesting. Their mystery seemed to make the connection feel more significant. The empath's ongoing attempts to understand them were, in their own way, a form of sustained attention and investment. But sustained attention over time without reciprocity eventually produces clarity rather than continued fascination. The empath begins to see patterns rather than complexity. The disappearing that once seemed emotionally layered now looks like a repeating behavior. The distance that once felt like emotional depth now reads as a consistent choice to avoid accountability. The mystery that once felt significant has become familiar enough to be recognized simply as a defense. And when the empath stops romanticizing these patterns and starts seeing them plainly, the emotional image the avoidant had been projecting begins to dissolve. They are no longer seen as the complicated, hard-to-reach person whose inner world was worth endless excavation. They are seen as someone who repeatedly chose emotional unavailability when presence was what the situation called for. This loss of idealization strikes at something the avoidant rarely acknowledges even to themselves, which is the degree to which their sense of emotional identity was maintained by being perceived as uniquely complex, unknowable, and therefore perpetually interesting. When someone finally sees through the mystique clearly enough to recognize it as a pattern rather than a profound mystery, the protection that mystique offered simply evaporates. The avoidant is no longer emotionally untouchable. They are human and recognizable and ordinary in their fear. And that recognition, quiet and unannounced, removes something they had been quietly depending on. The fifth and deepest shift occurs when the super-empath finds genuine peace without ever receiving the closure they once believed they needed. This is the one that tends to linger longest in the avoidant's internal experience. Most avoidant people carry an unspoken assumption that emotional connections remain essentially available even when they are being actively ignored or avoided. They assume that the other person is still out there waiting, still carrying unresolved questions, still emotionally anchored to the relationship by the very absence of resolution. That assumption is itself a form of control. Unanswered questions keep someone connected to the situation even when no active contact is taking place. Incompleteness is its own kind of presence. But when the superempath reaches a place of genuine inner peace, they stop needing those unanswered questions to be answered. They stop waiting for a conversation that was never coming. They stop holding the space open for a resolution that was never going to arrive in the form they once hoped for. Their healing does not require the avoidant's participation. Their sense of closure comes from within rather than from receiving any particular acknowledgement or explanation. They begin building a life that is genuinely moving forward, and the energy they once devoted to understanding and reaching the avoidant is now flowing into something entirely different. When the avoidant begins to sense this, something shifts in them that is genuinely difficult to sit with. The realization that their absence is no longer producing emotional weight in someone who once revolved around them creates a specific kind of internal reckoning. They had assumed that the silence would keep the empath waiting, that the unresolved nature of things would maintain a kind of emotional gravity that kept them relevant even without engagement. But that is no longer what is happening. The empath is not waiting. They are not stuck. They are healing and growing and building and moving in a direction that no longer curves back toward the avoidant at every turn. And that truth, quiet and undramatic as it arrives, creates an internal disruption that is hard to dismiss. After all of these shifts have accumulated, something begins happening inside the avoidant that unfolds slowly and mostly beneath the surface. From the outside, they may still appear calm, still maintain the same composed exterior, still perform the same emotional detachment that has always been their default presentation. But internally, a different kind of processing is underway. Emotions that were pushed down rather than felt begin to surface in new forms. Memories from the relationship return with a different quality, carrying weight they did not seem to carry at the time. Conversations are replayed with new attention. Small moments that seemed insignificant are now noticed and re-examined. The mind keeps returning to the same emotional territory, circling the same questions, as though trying to locate something it cannot quite name. Hidden regret begins forming not necessarily in the form of explicit remorse expressed to anyone, but as a quiet internal awareness that something valuable was present and that the choices made in response to it were not always the right ones. The obsessive quality of this internal replaying is itself uncomfortable for avoidant people because it is exactly the kind of emotional preoccupation they spent years trying to avoid. The loss of emotional certainty becomes perhaps the most disorienting part of the whole experience. The belief that they were in control of emotional closeness, that they were the one who decided when to engage and when to withdraw, and that the other person would remain available regardless, that belief no longer holds. And a belief system that has organized someone's entire emotional experience does not dissolve comfortably even when the evidence against it has become undeniable. What ultimately changes the entire dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant is not a dramatic confrontation. It is not revenge or retaliation or any kind of deliberate effort to cause the avoidant to feel what they once made the empath feel. It is something much quieter and far more powerful than any of those things. It is the moment the super empath chooses themselves, not as a tactic, not as a strategy designed to produce a particular reaction, simply as an honest recognition that they deserve more than what was being offered, and that honoring that recognition is more important than maintaining the relationship at the cost of their own peace. They stop overgiving. They stop stretching past their own limits to reach someone who was not meeting them halfway. They stop organizing their emotional life around someone who was consistently choosing distance over presence. And in making that choice, they quietly and completely dismantle the architecture of control the avoidant had built the entire dynamic around. The avoidant ego survives on the certainty of emotional access. It needs to know that someone is available, that the connection is retrievable, that the influence still operates even when it is not being actively exercised. When the super empath withdraws peacefully and completely, none of those certainties remain intact. The distance that once felt like power begins to feel like something entirely different. It begins to feel like loss, not the dramatic kind of loss that arrives with noise and tears and confrontation, but the quiet, creeping kind that settles in slowly once it becomes undeniable that what was there is genuinely no longer available in the same way. The super empath does not walk away having won anything in the conventional sense, because what they were engaged in was never a competition, nor a battle with a clear scoreboard. There is no trophy for endurance, no final medal for emotional sacrifice, and no meaningful victory in repeatedly abandoning oneself for the sake of being chosen by someone else. Instead, what they eventually arrive at is something quieter and far more foundational, the return to themselves. It is not dramatic, not performative, not rooted in proving a point. It is a decision that often comes after a long period of internal exhaustion, where the cost of staying emotionally overextended finally becomes more visible than the fear of letting go. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible shifts. They begin to recognize that love which requires self-erasure is not love that can sustain them, and connection that demands constant shrinking is not connection that can nurture them. This choice, made from a place of self-respect rather than reaction, is what changes everything internally. It is not born from anger, nor from an attempt to provoke realization in the other person. It is born from clarity, and clarity has a different emotional texture than hurt. Hurt reacts. Clarity decides. Hurt oscillates between reaching and retreating. Clarity steps aside and observes the pattern without needing to re-enter it. When someone who has long been emotionally available in an almost limitless way finally begins to place boundaries around their own energy, they are not withdrawing love from the world. They are redirecting it back toward the place it was always meant to begin. That redirection can feel unfamiliar at first, like stepping out of a long, dim corridor into open air where there is no longer anything to chase or fix. There is only space. And in that space, they begin to rediscover parts of themselves that were slowly eroded by overgiving, over-explaining, over-hoping. What makes this moment so significant is not its impact on the other person, but its restoration of internal balance. Choosing your own peace after a long time of abandoning it for someone else is not a small correction. It is a structural change in how the self relates to love. It redefines worth not as something earned through emotional labor, but as something inherent that does not require continuous validation from someone else's responsiveness. The super empath begins to understand, sometimes painfully and sometimes quietly, that their depth of feeling was never the issue. Their capacity to love was never the problem. The distortion came from where that love was placed and how much of it was given in exchange for inconsistency. And so when they finally choose themselves, it is not an act of withdrawal from love altogether, but a recalibration of where love is allowed to live. And when someone who once made themselves continuously available makes that choice, something shifts in the relational dynamic that cannot easily be reversed. The person who was accustomed to that availability may initially interpret the change in different ways depending on their awareness, emotional readiness, or avoidance patterns. Sometimes it is noticed slowly, through absence rather than announcement. Sometimes it is felt immediately, in the sudden silence where emotional access used to be readily present. But regardless of timing, what becomes undeniable is the change in pattern. The predictable access is no longer there. The emotional, always available space has become something more contained, more self-directed, more anchored elsewhere. And silence in this context begins to take on a different weight. That silence is not emptiness. It is not a tactic. It is not a message constructed to provoke response. It is simply the natural result of someone no longer overextending themselves into spaces where reciprocity was inconsistent or unclear. Yet from the outside, especially for someone who was accustomed to receiving steady emotional presence, that silence can feel unusually loud, not because it is meant to punish, but because it removes a layer of emotional noise that may have gone unexamined for a long time. Without that constant availability, the absence becomes noticeable in a way it was not before. What was once taken for granted as a stable background presence becomes something that is now clearly missing. But perhaps the most important part of this shift is not what the other person feels in response, but what the super empath no longer tolerates within themselves. They no longer interpret inconsistency as something to fix through more effort. They no longer translate distance into a problem that must be solved by self-sacrifice. Instead, they begin to recognize that peace is not something that arrives after emotional depletion, but something that must be protected while love is still present. And in that recognition, the entire definition of connection begins to change. It becomes less about proving depth through endurance and more about preserving wholeness through discernment. In the end, what remains is not a narrative of victory or loss, but a quiet return. A return to internal alignment. A return to emotional boundaries that feel like clarity rather than limitation. A return to a version of self that does not require absence of self in order to feel connected. And from that place, even silence is no longer charged with longing or expectation. It becomes simply space, space where something new may or may not grow, but where the self is finally no longer the thing being sacrificed to find out.